I watched the second episode of Tales from the Territories on Vice. The first one was really good, covering Memphis wrestling. This one focused specifically on the feud between Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman, and I thought was even better than the first episode. The roundtable was made up of the same 5 names from last week. They taped 2 episodes with them. Jerry Lawler, Dutch Mantell, Jimmy Hart, Jeff Jarrett, and Jerry Jarrett. And I just watched Lawler on the latest Table for 3 episode with Bret Hart and Mayor Kane. So I've had my Jerry Lawler fix for a while. There's nothing like sitting here and eating lunch while they show highlights of Lawler eating his own foot after his King of the Ring match with Bret, and then throwing up crackers and Diet Coke in the bathroom after the match. Vince McMahon, by the way, he was blown away by Lawler's ability to vomit on cue. He thought he just vomited on cue. When he talked to him later on in the night, he goes to Lawler, "How did you do that?" He had no idea. He had no idea that it was crackers and Coke. But there was a documentary many years ago. It used to air on Comedy Central all the time about Andy Kaufman called I'm From Hollywood. I have that jingle, that song from the documentary still burned in my brain. I must have watched that probably 5 or 6 times. I watched that thing. It was so good. I highly recommend watching it. If you can find it, it's on YouTube. The whole thing's on there. Here, in this episode, a lot of it was Jeff Jarrett pitching questions to Lawler about Andy Kaufman. And Lawler would just sit there and tell stories. And Lawler is a very good storyteller. So it was, I thought, a very enjoyable episode, even though I've heard a lot of these stories before. But Andy Kaufman was a huge wrestling fan growing up. He was a big fan of Buddy Rogers, who he knew was a bad guy who was trying to get people to dislike him. And that shaped the way that he did his comedy. He would try to make the audience as uncomfortable as possible. If you look up some old Andy Kaufman comedy bits, there's one where he sings this song called I Trusted You. He just sings that same lyric over and over and over again for like 3 minutes. That's the entire song, I Trusted You. There's other, and most people were cheering and laughing, but some people, like in the comments, were like, I don't see what's so funny about this. There's other bits where he would intentionally bomb, to see how the crowd would react, and not everybody got it. Not everybody understood his comedy. I think in some ways he was like the anti-comedian, but he hit it big with the TV show Taxi. He played the part of Latka on the show. Taxi was a big hit in the 70s and the early 80s. It was right before my time, so I have vague memories of seeing it when I was a kid. My parents would watch it. But he came up with his own gimmick as the intergender wrestling champion of the world, where he would offer money to women to wrestle him, and he would pay them if they could beat him. He actually approached Vince McMahon Sr. with the idea before he ever took it to Memphis. Vince, though, thought it was too showbiz. Just hilarious when you see what his son did to the company. And he didn't think it would work. There is footage, not in this episode, and this is just an FYI. There is footage of an interview that Vince Jr. did with Kaufman ringside at a Madison Square Garden show back in the late 70s, where he's in full heel mode. He's doing his entire heel shtick. He's offering $500 to any woman who could pin his shoulders to the mat, and how he thinks, women belong in the kitchen, cleaning and making babies, and Vince even starts corpsing during the promo, like Roman during a Sami Zayn promo. I really believe that had Vince Jr. taken over from his father a few years before he did, Kaufman would have been the first big celebrity crossover in WWE. Before Cyndi Lauper, before Mr. T, it would have been Andy Kaufman. If he didn't die so young, because he was only 35 when he passed away, that was the year before the first WrestleMania when he died. He absolutely would have been on that first WrestleMania. At least for an angle. Maybe not a match, but at least for an angle. Had he come along today, he'd be wrestling Bad Bunny on one of the Saudi Arabia shows. But he would find his way in there somehow, I guarantee it. But Bill Apter is the one who knew of the conversation that Andy had with Vince Sr. And Bill Apter was, he was the magazine writer, photographer. He was the one, he and George Napolitano both, and it was very cool this week when The Rock was doing the red carpet for Black Adam. he saw George, because George is still taking pictures, and he does more than just wrestling shows. I mean, I saw George, it was only a couple months ago. I'm very grateful to, consider him a friend. I've gotten to know him a little bit over the years. And George is great. I mean, he's a living legend in his own right. So he'll cover movie premieres and stuff, and he was on the red carpet for Rock's movie premiere. And Rock saw him and just went over to him in front of all the cameras and everything. He just went into this whole long thank you for all that you've done for me and my family over the years, and the attention that you've given us, and the photos that you've taken. And I think he toasted him with some of the Terramana tequila. It was very cool. It was a very cool way for The Rock to acknowledge him. But like George Napolitano and Bill Apter, these were the people who were so instrumental in people being discovered back then, because the magazines were so huge. And just by putting your picture on the cover of a magazine or in one of the magazines and writing about you, this is long before the age of social media and the internet, could make or break you and could get you discovered in another territory. So Bill Apter was covering the matches, and he overheard the conversation that Andy had with Vince Sr. And in the episode, they tell it that Apter told Andy to talk to Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett about doing something in the Memphis territory. And how the next day Andy spoke with Jarrett passed him off to Lawler, and the rest is history. In the actual version of events, as told by Bill Apter, the night that Andy got rejected by Vince, he went back to Apter's apartment in Queens, and he just couldn't understand why McMahon wasn't interested. And Apter was friends with Lawler, and he suggested that they call him to pitch the idea. So they called Jerry Lawler. It was around midnight, East Coast time. Lawler answers, and he couldn't believe that Bill Apter had Andy Kaufman, the TV star, sitting in his apartment in Queens. And a few days later, Andy called Apter from Lawler's house. They were already mapping out their plans. And so they would air videos of Kaufman on the episode. They would air videos of him insulting the people of Memphis, Tennessee. He did the whole, the whole voice, and how they were all a bunch of big dumb hicks with one tooth in their mouth. Kaufman came in and did his intergender wrestling champion gimmick, and it led to one night, Lawler pulled him off one of the women he was beating up on, this lady named Foxy, and that was the trigger to begin their feud. He said, "You can't put your hands on me. I'll sue you. I'll sue everybody in this building." And Lawler at the time, he was the quintessential babyface. So that's how their feud got going. And that's when they sat down to talk about having an actual match. Lawler sat down with him and said, "Look, I think we've reached the point in this now where it's about time where we talk about doing an actual one-on-one match." So it was April of 1982. They had footage of the match. Lawler lets him apply a headlock, and then he dumps him on the back of his neck with a back suplex. He folded this guy up. It was a hell of a bump. And then Lawler gave him a pile driver, which was banned at the time, so he was disqualified. And Kaufman was declared the winner. So Lawler decided, well, I'm already disqualified. What the hell? Let's give him another one. And he gave him a second pile driver, an even better pile driver. So to sell the injury, Kaufman, he refused to get up. And he told the referee, Jerry Calhoun, who was Lawler's best friend in real life, he knew him from high school, told him to call an ambulance. And Calhoun rushes over to Lawler, who's, he's playing to the crowd. He's mumbling under his breath. It's $300 for an ambulance. So you pick his ass up and you carry him to the back. And Calhoun rushes back over to Andy, then comes back to Lawler, and he tells Jerry, Andy says he'll pay for the whole thing. And Lawler tells him, call an ambulance. And Kaufman not only paid for the ambulance, he paid for his hospital stay. They assume, because Lawler said they never got a bill, even though Andy spent 3 days in the hospital. He was in a hospital bed. He had his neck in traction to keep the work alive and sell the injury. He wasn't hurt, but he had the doctors and the nurses convinced that he was. And this got coverage at all the big local news stations in and around Memphis. Jerry Jarrett claims he even got a call from Bill Watts, telling him how proud he is to be in the same business with him, and Watts thought the whole thing was legit, and that Kaufman deserved to have his neck broken. And Jarrett laughed that he didn't know how he was going to tell Bill Watts that he was being a mark, so instead he just thanked him and he hung up. But Andy would wear that neck brace everywhere he went. He wanted to wear it on Taxi, and they threatened to write him off the show if he didn't take it off, so ultimately he took it off. Tony Danza told Andy that he wanted to kick Lawler's ass for what he did to him. And Tony Danza was a pro boxer at one time. Like, legit. I looked it up. He had a 9-3 record with 9 knockouts. And Andy told Jerry, hey, Tony was a boxer, and he didn't want to let Tony know that they were working an angle. He didn't want to tell anybody that. And Lawler said, well, you can bring him to Memphis, but if Danzo wants to mix it up with me, if he thinks this whole thing is real, then I'd have to really fight him. So they agreed that it probably was best to keep him away from Memphis. Yeah, for Lawler's sake. For Lawler's sake. It was good that they kept Tony Danzo away from Memphis. I don't think that would have ended well for the King. So they showed footage of their famous segment on the David Letterman Show, which came months after the match. So Andy is still wearing this neck brace. This is in July. The match was in April. So he's been wearing the neck brace, outside of, on the set of Taxi, he's been wearing the neck brace for months to sell this injury. That's how committed to this he was. Andy called Lawler on the phone and says, how would you like to be on the David Letterman Show? And of course, Lawler was like, of course. This is national mainstream recognition for this guy. This is so much bigger than just Memphis. Lawler has said that Andy Kaufman is the best thing that ever happened to his career because it got him national exposure for the first time. This is long before Vince McMahon ever did. This is what got Jerry Lawler national exposure. And Andy called him because he had this idea. Had this idea that Lawler would slug him. And what do you think of it, right? And so Lawler said, well, first of all, the show is taped. So if we tried anything like that, it probably wouldn't air. That's number one. Number two, they would call the police and I would be arrested. And Kaufman said, yeah, you're probably right. But man, wouldn't it be great? And they left it at that. So we get to the show, and what they did here is they spliced real footage from the Letterman Show in with these shadowy, like dramatic reenactments. They get into a back and forth. Lawler calls Andy a wimp, and Andy threatens to sue over what he did to him. Now, mind you, again, this is months later. He'll sue retroactively, I guess, for what Lawler did to him earlier in the year. He says, I didn't sue you because I'm not that kind of guy. And Lawler comes back with, well, what kind of guy are you? So Lawler, at this point, he figures the segment is over. He gets up, and he's looking at Andy, and just something came over him that just said, do it. And he slaps the taste out of Kaufman's mouth, knocks him right out of his chair. Now let's take a step back here. They were booked on Letterman's show with the idea that they were there to bury the hatchet. That's why they were booked on the show. In his book, Lawler said that they both met with Letterman's producer to go over the segment. And the producer wanted Lawler to be a little adversarial, maybe argue back and forth. And then they would go to break. They would come back. Andy would apologize for making fun of wrestling. Lawler would apologize for hurting him. And Andy would get up and he would sing, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." So that was the plan. And then came the conversation where Andy asked Lawler, so what do you think about what they want us to do? And Lawler told him, well, it's fine. It could be funny, but it's pretty much going to be the end of our program. It's going to be the end of our angle if we do this. And Andy says, yeah, I know. I don't like that. I wish there was something else that we could do. He says, what if I refused your apology and you just slugged me? And that's when Lawler explained all this stuff about how, well, the show is taped and they'd probably arrest me. And Andy made the comment, yeah, you're probably right, but man, wouldn't that be great? And in the book, he said Andy told him, just think about it, before he hung up the phone. And that was the last that they spoke. They did not see each other again until they were on stage together on the show. Lawler didn't know what Andy was going to do. Andy didn't know what he was going to do. It was mostly just ad-libbed. Things got out of hand. Lawler smacks the shit out of him. When they come back from the commercial, Andy just launches into this profanity-laced tirade. He's threatening to sue Lawler. He's calling him a fucking asshole. I always get a kick out of watching the uncensored version of this on YouTube. Lawler claims Dave wasn't smartened up about anything that they did. Letterman on Mark Maron's podcast a few years ago claimed that Andy did clue him in about the slap and that Andy was good about that. For all the times he had him on the show, Andy would always let him know in advance what he was going to do. So that's what Letterman claims. So then from there, Andy goes back to Memphis. He just keeps coming back every week. He's flying himself out there. He just loves this stuff. Jimmy Hart brings up the time that Lawler burned him in an angle. He burned Jimmy. And so for a while there, Jimmy was wrapped up. He'd come out in bandages looking like a fucking mummy. He was all wrapped up. Like the Invisible Man. Well, Andy showed up at a show in Arkansas to meet up with Jimmy. And has this idea of what if we put Andy in Jimmy's jacket with the face wrapped up with all the bandages, and he screws over Lawler, and the crowd is just ready to just riot, right? When he takes off the wraps, they find out that it was Kaufman and not Jimmy Hart. So they did that. They did this angle where, of course, when he first comes out, you think it's Jimmy Hart under the bandages, but it turns out, Jimmy Hart comes out to attack Lawler. Well, if that's Jimmy, then who's under the bandages? And he unwraps himself, and we see that it's Andy Kaufman, still trying to fuck over Jerry Lawler. And so from there, Kaufman put a bounty on Lawler. He would pay if anybody could hit the king with a pile driver. They did these handicap matches for comedy where, Jimmy Hart and Kaufman would be a team against Jerry Lawler. And, they would be like, all right, on the count of three, we're both going to go at him. And then, Jimmy would count to three and Kaufman would stand back and Jimmy would get his ass kicked. So it was played up for comedy. So this all built to an angle on TV in studio where Andy and Jimmy end up getting into a fist fight with none of the punches connecting. I mean, these are two people who haven't been in a fight in their entire lives who are trying to throw punches. So he's just having the time of his life. And then ultimately they come to find out, he admits that he's sick. Now at first, when he told Jimmy Hart that he was sick, he came in one week. And Jimmy's like, yeah, you probably just got a cold from flying back and forth from New York to Memphis. He just thought maybe, again, he had the cold, the flu, whatever it may have been. Finds out that it wasn't a cold. He admits to them that he has lung cancer. Because they were doing a promo at one point on TV, and they had footage of it. Lawler was in studio, Kaufman was on screen, or he sent in a tape maybe. But he's coughing. He coughs a couple of times during the promo, and then Lawler said after the fact, Andy apologized, for coughing, and that's when he found out that he had lung cancer. So basically, they milked this thing for every dime that they possibly could. And I don't know what kind of business those matches were doing towards the end. I mean, my sense of it is they weren't selling out at the end there like they were for the first match between them. It was probably the law of diminishing returns. I don't know how much longer that would have gone on for, even if Andy wasn't sick. But they milked it for all that they could. And even when he was sick and he knew he was sick, Andy would still fly out because he just loved being part of the wrestling business. He would fly out there and he would do all of his stuff. It just got to a point where he couldn't do it anymore. And he got sicker and sicker, and he passed away in 1984. They have footage of a promo from Memphis TV where Lance Russell asks him, he goes, I know this is a touchy subject. We know what you think of this guy, but I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts on the death of Andy Kaufman? And Lawler just stays in kayfabe mode, and he's like, well, I don't know that I'm the best person to be asking about this. I didn't like the guy, but obviously I'm sorry to hear that he died, but, again, I'm not the best person to be talking to about this. He tried to keep kayfabe as much as possible. So Lawler in the episode says he thinks that Andy Kaufman should be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, even though he never worked for WWE. There are plenty of people who never worked for WWE who are in their Hall of Fame right now, though. And he mentioned that Triple H has even expressed in the past how much Andy Kaufman meant to the wrestling business. I agree with this. I agree with what Lawler said here in this episode. If they're going to continue with this celebrity wing stuff, if they're going to put people in the Hall of Fame like that who aren't actually wrestlers, but they were part of it in some way, then there's no reason Andy Kaufman should not be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And I'm not saying that Andy Kaufman should be in the Hall of Fame because, well, Drew Carey's in the Hall of Fame. Or William Shatner's in the Hall of Fame. William the Refrigerator Perry is in the Hall of Fame. So therefore, you got to put Andy Kaufman in. Now, Andy Kaufman should be in the Hall of Fame based on his own merits. He had a huge influence on Lawler's career and on that Memphis territory. and the Letterman stuff. I mean, this was a major mainstream angle. Lawler has said in the past, he said Andy once told him he would give up everything he was doing in Hollywood just to stay involved in the wrestling business. That's how much he loved it. Lawler and Jarrett in the episode claimed that they found out later on that Andy never cashed a single one of his paychecks from wrestling. His parents found them one day after he passed away, and Jarrett said that they had to change banks at one point, and that's how he found out that the checks were never cashed. Because he said to the bank, "Is everything okay now?" And they're like, "Yeah, the only thing is we found these checks, addressed to Andy Kaufman that were never cashed." It wasn't about the money to him. He already had money. He had money, he had fame. He just loved doing it. Even though people probably looked at him and thumbed their noses, "Oh, what are you doing the wrestling thing for?" I remember even in the I'm From Hollywood documentary, the Comedy Central one, Robin Williams was interviewed for it. And even Robin Williams, he couldn't understand why Andy was doing this. But he did it anyway, even though he knew that people were probably going to look down on him for it. It didn't stop him from wanting to be involved in wrestling. In a lot of ways, I think Andy was a genius. I really do. I think he was. Some people don't get his comedy. He wasn't a great comedian. I think that's the thing that people miss. I don't think Andy Kaufman was a great comedian. I think he was a master at controlling the crowd and manipulating the audience into reacting a certain way, which is the hallmark of every great personality in pro wrestling. Kaufman never had any formal wrestling training, and he is going to go down as one of the greatest heels of all time. He just got it. He understood it. He worked the fans into wanting to kill him. He worked the doctors and the nurses in the hospital into thinking he really did hurt his neck. He worked his co-stars on Taxi into thinking that it was real, to the point where Tony Danza wanted to kill Jerry Lawler. He worked his own parents into thinking that Lawler tried to really break their son's neck. His father told Lawler years later when they were making the Man on the Moon movie with Jim Carrey that they hated him for years because of that. He worked everybody because it amused him. Andy Kaufman wasn't the king of comedy. He was the king of kayfabe. Even though I knew most of the details already and I've heard Lawler tell these stories before, I like the episode a lot. I really enjoy the format, just having these guys sitting around telling stories with the reenactments spliced in. It's one of the reasons I loved the Legends of Wrestling show that WWE did on its old 24/7 on-demand service. They didn't have reenactments because they already owned all the actual footage. They didn't need to reenact it. But it was just 4 or 5 guys just sitting around, shooting the shit, telling stories. This Tuesday's episode covers the AWA, as if Tuesday isn't a busy enough night this week. You've got the AWA episode. They have Bret Hart for the Stampede episode in a few weeks, which was a big get for them, especially since the same people behind this are the ones behind Dark Side of the Ring, and they were on Bret's shit list after the Montreal episode. But they're all good now. They've made up, and they were able to get Bret for that episode. They've also got, on the Stampede one, they've got Abdullah the Butcher and Dr. D, David Schultz. I don't know what week that's airing, but that should be a good one as well. Now, I said last week that Vice was working on a Vince McMahon documentary, and we had an air date for it, which was October 18th, which happens to be this Tuesday. Well, that is no longer airing on Tuesday because it would be ridiculous to air that on Tuesday from 8 to 10 up against NXT and AEW. So why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. So it's been bumped. We don't know yet what the new air date is going to be, but as soon as I hear what it is, I'll make sure I let you guys know.